Hey, movie lovers, welcome back for another Anatomy of Movie here at Popcorn Talk. Today, we travel all the way back in time to Elizabethan times where her versus Mary, Queen of Scots, dueled it out. Not physically, but certainly mentally. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Popcorn Talk, featuring movie discussion, news, and interviews. Popcorn Talk. We talk movies. And now, here's Popcorn Talk's Anatomy of a Movie.
That's right, ladies and gentlemen. We are doing Mary, Queen of Scots, starring Margot Robbie and Saoirse Ronan. She has a lot of different... Close enough. I will... There's a great video on Wired's YouTube channel where Saoirse Ronan explains how to say her name, and still I don't know how to say her name, so I apologize. But that's neither here nor there. We have Marisa Serafini.
Hello, everyone.
I'm Phil Svitek. And as mentioned, we are talking about the movie. Now, for those of you joining us for the very first time, take note that we are not just a movie review show. Yes, we will give our thoughts and opinions. We're going to discuss the plot lines therein. But we also go a little bit deeper. We're going to talk about the historical context. And furthermore, we're going to talk about how this movie got made, the behind the scenes, all that good stuff, culminating into, in this case, not a big box office because it's still very limited release. We are lucky enough that we've gotten to see it before it goes into wide release, but we're going to kind of talk about it, how we feel it can contend against, in the award season. So that's what you have to look forward to. By that nature, by that description, you can kind of tell that it's going to be spoiler-filled a little bit. But if you know the history, then it won't be as spoiler-y. But nonetheless, you have been warned. And lastly, if you want to follow along with us, we do have PDF that you can click. It's in the description box and it has all of our various notes that sometimes we don't get to all the time, but we will certainly draw from. So without further ado, Marisa, overall thoughts on Mary, Queen of Scots?
Wow. Wow, in a good way, because it's so great to see two women of power, especially back then in this time where it's such a man's world. I mean, it still is today, unfortunately. But these two women of regency power, just how they go about living their lives, how they go about the society and all the duties that they have to do and all the political strife that they have to go through. I applaud them. And admittedly, I don't really know any story and the backstory of Mary Stuart, so it's interesting to see her life and what she went through. We really know Queen Elizabeth. I mean, she's iconic in the figure in that sense, but I never really realized how those two lined up just in the timeline, and I love how this movie put things into better understanding and comprehension for me. It was great to see these two actresses just mentally go at it, even though we feel watching the whole film they're kind of always together, somewhat on the same wavelength and the same parts of their lives really line up, but yet they only share one scene. And it's crazy because it just shows how well and how in symbiotic sense that they were and yet weren't. And it was great to see these two women, and these actresses are fantastic. Alone, put them together, brilliant.
Yeah. Ironically enough, one of the things that made me appreciate this movie a lot more is that I knew a little bit of the backstory. Now, of all places, CW's Reign gave me that backstory, which wasn't a historically accurate TV show by any means, but nonetheless, it gave me enough of the broad strokes to understand Darnley's full context and the Lennoxes and even John Knox and so forth. Not that you didn't get it in this movie, but I just appreciate that I had that sense of going into it, so I could more enjoy it than have to process it in the moment. And what I did process was how hard it was for both of them to be rulers. I mean, for any woman at that time to be in power was astronomical. And for them, you could tell that they, in essence, could and would have wanted to be friends. It just didn't match up, and that was the hard part about it.
Logistically, it didn't make sense for them to be friends.
Yeah, all things considered, they just could not be friends. And yet, as time goes by, they grow into a further isolation because of the men around them, and the only people that they have is themselves. And again, the one thing that they want, they cannot have.
No.
That is the true travesty of all of it. And I, for all it's worth, I appreciated the main focus being on Mary, but I felt there was a good balance with having Elizabeth and the times that they gave her in the movie, where it wasn't just purely a Mary movie,
No, and I liked how, granted, the movie's called Mary, Queen of Scots, so she's going to be the main focus. But I liked how it showed how her life paralleled with Queen Elizabeth, how it just paralleled with what everything went on just in England, in Scotland, at that time where we had the rebellions, the wars, why they went to war. And it just puts things in a better perspective of how we understand just the historical context of everything.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Well, speaking of that, let's give some historical context to the movie aspect of it, right? So this goes back quite a bit. In fact, Scarlett Johansson, even in the mid-2000s, was slated to do this movie, but it just wasn't to be. And so then in 2012, that's when kind of things picked up. Saoirse Ronan got involved. Now that's 2012. We are living in 2018. Mm-hmm. So even with her signed on, it still took a while to get here. And it wasn't really until 2016 that things really started to take off, and we got the movie that we in essence did. But the nice part is that it gave Saoirse Ronan that time to really study the character and appreciate her.
Right, and it helps that Saoirse is the age now in real life that Queen Mary was when she ruled. So it really puts her into the literal steps of being someone of that age ruling and being the character. And I like when you can tell when an actor had time to mull over their characters, had time to fully develop like everything that they're going to put into their characters. And you saw that when I was watching this film, wasn't watching Saoirse. I was watching Queen Mary Scots trying to rule everybody, or more so rule herself. And I think it was amazing.
Yeah, and when you look at it from that perspective, that's Margot Robbie did have some reservations for the role simply because she didn't know if she could carry it out, but she kept getting inquired, let's just say, and after a while, she was like, okay, let's do it, and I think she does an equally magnificent job with it, and whatnot. And I think that what's interesting is the duality where Elizabeth keeps saying, court has made me a man, whereas Mary, I think, retains her womanhood just in spite of everything that may have happened.
Yeah, and I like the two differences because we see Mary, she uses her femininity and her womanhood as her tool for power. She's like, just because I'm a woman doesn't mean I can't do anything as well as you guys. And I love that mentality. And we see why she survived so long on her, like, kind of by herself. Against all these people. And when you, on the flip side with Queen Elizabeth, you see why she has survived, because she has assimilated herself and associated herself more as men, so she could also survive. So the different mentalities that both of these women had just to keep working and keep surviving in the political aspect that they were, it's interesting.
It is. And I go to, this is kind of, let's say, 3/4 into the movie, where Mary says to her brother, and I forget the other guy's name, she says, like, how many times have you told me I can't do something and I've proved you wrong? Mm-hmm. And then on the flip side, Elizabeth talks to her ambassador and she says, how many talks have you had and what has it led to? So, the interesting angle of it being that Mary has ruled under her way and gotten to certain results, but in the long term of things, it was her downfall, as Elizabeth says to her, your strengths are also your greatest weaknesses. And in that respect, Elizabeth lost her humanity, let's say, certainly her womanhood,
her identity,
but she has kept her throne. Mm-hmm. And it's when you look at it from that perspective, like, I'm trying to find a perspective that isn't quite sad.
No, and it's really unfortunate that that's how. Those are the things that they had to do just to make it in the work world that they were in.
Yeah, and the other aspect of it is, so this was directed by a woman. I'm very glad it was, Josie Rourke.
Yeah.
This is her feature debut, by the way. She was known for doing plays and so forth, but she handled it with such care, and the way they describe things in general, sex, in terms of pleasure, was different. It was more about sex as a means to something. It was almost like a chore, like that was your duty because you had to produce an heir, and the way they went about it. It's just interesting to kind of view it from that perspective, because we see a lot of sides of sex. We some, early on, we see some. It's not sex 100%, but it's pleasure certainly. We see violent sex. We see loveless sex.
We see leisurely sex when it came to the men sleeping with each other.
Yeah, and we even saw adultery to an extent. Certainly, like I look at Elizabeth and Dudley.
Yeah, and I believe Saoirse mentioned in an interview that sex back then and just sexuality was way more fluid from person to person. But also you have to remember that because they are in a position of monarchy and regency, that majority of the time sex was mostly just to produce an heir, to keep the line going, for the bloodline going. And now we feel, just in today's modern society, sex is mostly for pleasure, not for the duty of keeping a family, line going. So it's just the differences of what sex meant back then and how it was used and how it was portrayed. It's such a different mentality.
Yeah, and I think there's got to be a fine balance ultimately between the two. It shouldn't just be, I think there's a human side to it too that's beyond just pleasure. But at the same token, it was very awkward to watch it. I almost felt like one of the sisters outside the door at times, and I guess what made it more awkward is, unlike them, who probably had an idea of what was actually happening, I did know what was happening because the movie showed me.
Right.
So from that perspective, I can't think of one sex scene with Elizabeth though, unless I'm mistaken.
No, because they made it, and it's known that Elizabeth never married, never produced children, never, and there was a moniker for her, Virgin Mary. I'm sorry, Virgin Elizabeth, and in that sense, because she never married, so it doesn't actually make sense to see her with a man.
Yeah, and from that perspective too, when you talk about sex as pleasure, marriage really was also quite different from that. Marriage was not for love. It was all about strengthening alliances and so forth. And what started off maybe for Mary and Darnley, the fact that they could have had a romantic relationship just quickly spiraled into nothingness. And at that point, what are you left with?
Oh, that was painful. Painful, because we're led to believe that he did actually on some level care for her. But then when you just see the characters and true colors come out, you're like, oh no, this is toxic. And you just feel bad for her, because Mary, in the end, still ends up by herself.
Yeah.
And now she's going against him because he betrayed her in so many ways. Emotions, loyalty, killing her best friend. Oh.
And in spite of that, she had the wherewithal. She's like, he's still my husband, and I gave him my loyalty. So it's not. It'd be one thing if she ordered the murder on him. It wasn't her, and that's when you really look at it from that way. Interestingly enough, we don't see Frances and her relationship with Francis. But that was when she was least experienced, obviously. We do kind of get mention of it, of it didn't last that long. And it just seems like with every... But I almost imagine that relationship to be the most loving and in some ways beneficial. Again, I'd love to see it from the eyes of this movie. But with each progression, by the time we get to Bothwell, There's no love there. There's no nothing.
Yeah, and I'm glad we didn't spend just in movie time and spend a lot of time with him, because we at this point we're so connected to Mary, and anything that wrong that happens to her, we just feel for her. And the moment that he already forced her to abdicate and be in a marriage, you're like, oh girl, this is even worse than your last marriage that you had. But it also just shows how great of a person Mary was, because she was such a devout Catholic. She was so loyal, and within Catholicism, and I'm Catholic so I can speak to this, it's usually like, you're married, you made a commitment, and it's till death do you part. And she always waited until her husband technically died. So she never cheated. So I'm like, and I give her that for being the devout Catholic, where she did stick to the actual rules of commitment of a marriage. But boy, did that work against her.
It did. I mean, to have your second husband killed by your third husband.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing, at the end of the day, like, Mary almost gave everyone a common enemy, and everyone was like, all the men were having hushed whispers throughout court of like, blah, 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 this about Mary. But it felt very much like I was very curious of, if it wasn't her, you guys would still find something to bitch about.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like John Knox was friendly with anyone else.
No.
I don't think I can't see him and Bothwell going out for a round of beers or something like that.
Heck no.
Or even James.
No, but it also shows that there were really, and this is going to sound terrible, I apologize, but there were hardly any guys or any men in this movie that were likable, except for the best friend, who unfortunately gets slaughtered. It's hard to pick out a guy that you actually liked.
Well, even him, I think there was that very important, I say important scene, because he's trying on like the women's clothes, and Mary tells him, like, be who you are with us. And so I think it just goes to show he was more feminine than masculine, and that's why you say that, I think.
Sodomy.
And he had no station in life, really, and so let's just put it this way. If they could, the guys wished Mary could have a similar murder like they did to him. But they had to go about it a little bit differently.
But man, her best friend, I'm trying to remember his name right now. It was awful, because he was arguably like the most likable guy, even though he was more feminine than everybody else. But
David Rizzo.
Yeah.
Rizzio. Sorry.
We liked him, and then the way that he was killed was so brutal and merciless. It was terrible to see. We were witnesses, while Mary was a witness, and the people who were involved with it, it was her husband that signed off on it. And it's even more terrible, because we can tell that the husband, Darnley, also liked him, just from a man to man, and that was painful, because that was such a betrayal in so many different ways, in friendship and just in love.
Yeah. And she forgave him too.
She still forgave him.
All these people, she found a way to forgive, which I thought...
She was laying in his arms literally like hours later. Like, how could you? So I applaud Mary. She's a better person than I would have been.
And I want to talk about the brother for a moment, because when you talk about that bond, there was such a love there from her to him. And she when they're walking through and she's talking about how he used to hold her, and how she wants that for her son, for him to love him the same way he loved her. And he breaks down into those tears, and I thought that was a very heartfelt moment. And then, a couple scenes later, he's doing quite the opposite.
Mm-hmm. It's painful, because when we see Darnley, admittedly at the beginning of the film, I was kind of rooting for him.
You mean James?
James, sorry. Yeah. All these names, James. But it's just so unfortunate, because there are still like glimmers of hopes in some of the characters, and you can see where like he has done wrong. He's begged for forgiveness, she has forgiven, and then he does wrong again. It's very human and realistic in that way, but even still at the end, how it turned out, the relationship still strained.
Well, very strange. And it's not like the things he did were just like minor misdemeanors. This was major stuff. And, you know, one of the things that he neglects very early on when they have their civil war, right? The first one.
Mm-hmm.
There's that great moment where Bothwell is about to essentially
chop off his head.
Yeah, and she makes that very conscious decision to call it there and not have that happen. But she looks at him and she says, like, just so you know, I chose this.
Mm-hmm.
And I chose to not have this happen to you. So you're welcome. And the fact that he never takes it in that way is sad.
I really like that scene because it was very telling in a lot of ways, because also just the placement and the blocking of it, because she's on top of a hill, so she's physically above him, and the fact that she has the power to call the civil war to the point where it could have killed her own brother, yet she also had the power to call it off and save his life all within a matter of seconds. I was like, she has such a higher hand than he does, and I really liked it because it just shows, like, in one instant call she could have ended his life, and yet she still kept forgiving him and taking him back.
Yeah, absolutely. And
oh, Mary.
If I had one sort of nitpick with the movie, it's that since we focus so much heavily on Mary and her ambition was to unite England and Scotland, she didn't accomplish that. But then the line ends with, like, I hope my son does, and then we get the little text that says he basically did do that.
He did.
I felt that if that was just a little bit strengthened, I think it could have worked. What we did get was she obviously loved her son very much so, and that in itself was one of the... It just got more tragic and tragic as things went along. She can't even be with her son.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not the first time. We see it in other television shows or in movies and stuff that depict the actual monarchy line. It's just like, usually they always have to protect the son because they're the next one in line to be the heir. So you always see them sending off their first, second, third sons away just in hiding, so no one can kill them and assassinate them and end their line. So it is unfortunate. You see how much she loves her son, but also how much she loves her country, that she had to send him away just to save his life.
Yeah, and then, you know, it's an interesting point that you bring up, because remember her with her sisters, and she's like, let's just go back. Like, you know, it's just land, essentially, the sister tells her, and she's like, no, it's my country.
Mm-hmm.
And she know through and through, from day one to all the way to the end, she feels a sense of patriotism, and that she will not let go of it.
Yeah, and I'm glad that James ruled that he did something that she could not, but like, she paid the price, yet he ultimately won in the end, but she paid the dues for it.
Yeah, well, you know, in that sense, it had to get there, right? I mean, unfortunately, it had to be a guy.
Mm-hmm.
Just this world at that day and age was just not accepting of a woman.
No. They're more cruel towards women, and well, they're also cruel towards guys too, especially if they produce male heirs. They're after the sons first, because that's how you immediately end the line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, it was a very, very interesting time. Like, part of, you know, when you look at it, part of why Elizabeth felt so threatened was because England, while it was a major power, they had a lot of things that they had to take care of. They just were involved in a war. And when you do have power, people are always asking you for help. And, you know, the Spanish fleets were kind of becoming stronger and stronger and so forth. So, you know, as England, their biggest commodity was their navy. It certainly wasn't, you know, necessarily their troops and so forth. And when that's being threatened, I don't think there was ever a good day. If I look, I don't know. Maybe I have a very grim view of that medieval times, but didn't seem that happy.
Well, no, I think any part of Regency and any part being in the monarch line that's not a business you want to get into. But once you're in it, it's it's literally survival of how to stay in it.
Well, and I if nothing else, this movie made me appreciate our modern day in society, simply because, like, yes, you can look at it from the perspective of having political power, but then also if you're a peasant, your life is not that much better either. So pick your poison type of situation.
Right. You also just feel for Mary because we know she's the rightful heir by blood. And yet she had to fight the hardest to stay her ground and prove her her actual legitimacy against people who weren't.
No.
And that's what's unfortunate, because we know she's the rightful heir. Yes, she shouldn't have to work this hard.
Yeah, well, they are just not.
But because she's a woman, they pushed harder.
Well, that, and also, like, there's a lot of stuff going on. It was that, but she's also Catholic, and
against Protestants, and she's in foreign territory too, so she had to fight harder in that sense.
Yeah, and I know, like, the Catholic Church did have, like, basically, if you needed funding, the Catholic Church was your bank at that point in time, which, you know, I'm not saying it was, but you can certainly view it you can make the argument, certainly John Knox did and would, that, you know, that's corrupt. And so, you know, Mary represents the good side of Catholicism, but there's certainly a bad side to it. You know, people in whatever fashion are good and they're evil.
Yeah, but the business side of it, like, she represents the morality, the good moral sense of Catholicism, but also they shed light on the bad business side of Catholicism.
Absolutely. So, and that was tough to take, because you saw those glimpses. We were just talking about the battle versus the brother. As they're walking, there's that great moment of, like, the guy from where he is. Oh, he's a Protestant, but he's like, I'm happy to serve under you. And that was a great moment, because like, at the end of the day, we're one country.
Yeah, and she's just a good person in general, you can tell, because you always saw, like, I can't count how many times we actually saw her take the initiative to get on a frickin' horse and go to wherever she needed to be, fight alongside her actual men that are working for her. We only saw Elizabeth on a horse once, and it was only to meet Mary. It was never to fight. It was never to be in the war, in the trenches with her people. It was only to meet someone. So it always just showed Mary took the initiative to actually fight legitimately with her people for her country.
And 2 points there. Number one, Elizabeth makes that very deliberate choice. She says, when she gives the order to go ahead with the Civil War, she says, I don't want to know anything about it. Which, you know, so, like, not only does she not want to be there, she doesn't even care to read about it.
She turns the other cheek.
And
Mary's there.
Yeah. So secondly, let's talk about that meeting. A very infamous meeting that never actually happened.
That never happened.
But as they kind of say, from that perspective, it from a cinematic standpoint, you need them to meet. It just felt right, and that became kind of the crux of it. And the way they were firing on all cylinders, between dialogue, which I would attribute to the writing, between the direction, which I would attribute to the cinematography and of course the director, and then the acting, the way they played it off. Damn.
Yeah. I mean, it was a trifecta of amazingness just in this one pure scene. Because the whole movie, and as a viewer, I was like, when are they ever going to actually share the screen together?
I thought for sure they would, because I knew they never met. I was like, well, I guess we're just going to get letters.
See, in me not knowing the history, I was like, they have to meet once. With all the letter correspondence, I was like, it makes sense that they only met at least once. And so I'm watching the film, I was like, when are they going to meet? And finally, when we get it, it was just done so eloquently. It was kind of bittersweet, but beautiful at the same time. And knowing the fact afterwards that was Margot Robbie's last day, and Saoirse's first day, to be on, like, different, even emotional planes, and work-wise, to make it somewhat in sync, was amazing as actresses.
Yeah, they nailed that, and that was their first time seeing that was their first time working on that day, but it was also their first time seeing each other. When they have that reaction of like, oh, this is what you look like, that was pure.
That was real time, real life reaction, because it was Margot's choice to actually not see Saoirse during the filming. She purposely kept her distance to add to the character development, and it makes sense because when you see them, that is a real time first take reaction of them first seeing each other in makeup, in costume, and in character. But it's believable. It translates on screen that this is the first meeting, when really it was.
Yeah, and it's so unfortunate. In real life, Mary, she was noted for her beauty, and that's such a, like, the way Elizabeth takes off the wig, and you could just see, like, she's been beaten down. Sickness has beaten her, but then also men and so forth, and that's why she looks a little bit androgynous towards the end.
Mm-hmm. And I loved how Elizabeth did have the moment of realization. She's like, I was jealous. I was jealous of your youth, beauty, power, and all that, and Mary's legitimacy to the actual throne, where Elizabeth has had to work her way to where she is. You do feel for her in that sense, because she has lost a lot physically, emotionally, her identity, especially when she said she's more of a man than anything. And you feel for Elizabeth, because also we just watched this whole movie about what Mary went through, but we hardly actually really see what Elizabeth has gone through. I mean, besides the smallpox and stuff, but Elizabeth has already been in a position of power for so long. And I think Margot did a great job.
I think she did too, and ultimately, like, when I look at Elizabeth, certainly from the movie's perspective, she was just she succumbed to this idea of what was best for Britain, as dictated by her Privy Council, because I think there was a third option she was not seeing that Mary was, and she just wasn't accepting of it. I think had it gone Mary's way, they could have become friends and they could have been allies, but even then, you could tell Elizabeth wants to help Mary, but she imprisons her, and eventually she has to kill her. She's given no other choice. Like, and that final letter of like, hey, no matter what happens, like, I have to do this.
I have to act upon this. And that's also, this is where I really had a frustration with the movie. I mean, overall, I really did enjoy this film, but just as a general viewer, and again, not knowing the history, I felt like so cheated that we didn't see the actual trying the political coup that Mary tries to overthrow her. In that sense, I wanted to see that, because we get to the point where Elizabeth finally just on a civil note agrees to protect her, but at a distance, and then we skip all these years, legitimately skip years, to the point where now you're gonna get beheaded. Yeah. And I'm like, what happened? Just as a viewer, I was like, now show me what she did so you get the actual call to behead her.
Well, let me ask you this. Did you, as you're watching, did you really think Mary had anything to actually do with that? Because I think that John Knox, and this part of history is a little bit unclear to me, and that was a historical expert to begin with, but John Knox a lot of times did bad things in the name of Mary and good things in the name of John Knox. So what I think as I interpreted the movie, whether it was John Knox or somebody else, someone did bad in the name of Mary, quote unquote, when Mary had nothing to do with it, but because there's traces that lead to her, Elizabeth has to, and I think she knows better that this is a farce, that this was a plot to frame Mary, but because of all the pressures, she has no choice but to do what's
just
quote unquote needed. Yeah.
Having watched the film, and now we're at the end of it, like, I don't believe it is in Mary's character to overthrow Elizabeth after she spent so many years trying to form a friendship. Why would she now try to overthrow her? I didn't believe that Mary did, but when you say when it was like John Knox doing things under the guise that is Mary, it makes me feel even more for Mary that people just use her name,
Yeah.
and yet she's the one who paid.
Yeah. Yeah, but I did appreciate how she went out. You know, and there's that line from both men, like, what does she think, she's a martyr? Well, she went out on her own terms. Yeah, she chose how she was going to go out. And not necessarily like, it's not like she signed up to be beheaded, but she was going to do it. If that was her fate, then she was going to have a smile on, and she was going to do it at, whatever things that she could control in that situation, she was going to do it.
Yeah. And I know just from like other historical monarchy lines and what have you, that sometimes they do give you the choice of how you want to die. I know someone, I'm forgetting the name, but like there's one instance where someone like decided to be drowned in wine. It's like, so I don't know if this was like Mary's choice to be beheaded, unless that was actually Elizabeth's particular choice to be like, you're going to get beheaded, not hung or what have you. Like, this is your version of execution.
Yeah, I think at a certain point, England just got people became obsessed with beheading instead of hangings and so forth.
Yeah,
so
the guillotine is a popular choice.
The French invented that to make killing a little bit smoother.
Yep.
There's your history lesson right there. We create a lot of good in the world. Not we, but like the humanity we.
But they used an axe for her, so that was...
Thanks.
Oh, yes.
Thanks.
Yep. Perfect timing on that one.
All right. Let's talk about the editing, because at the top, when you mentioned your overall thoughts, you felt emotionally they were very connected. And, well, it's because they made a very conscious effort to do so. Mm-hmm. The intercutting, when they showed a portion of Mary, they wanted to play a similar aspect from Elizabeth's side. So, you got that feeling, and like you felt like when the hell they got to meet.
They have to. Because they're somewhat in the same parts of their lives, or this. And I did like the parallel and juxtapositions between both of them, where there's a moment where we see Mary announces that she's pregnant, and then we cut to Elizabeth, and there's literally the birth of a horse, or birth of a stallion. And then we cut back to a moment where Mary finally gives birth, and then literally cuts from blood from Mary to the red flowers from Elizabeth in the same style. And so I liked how they cut back enough, and they're similar type of cuts where you can understand that they are linked, just in same points of their lives.
Yeah, they just had this telepathy. They knew what the other was doing ultimately. Now, I want to turn it over to you for wardrobe, because I appreciate the wardrobe, but I also appreciate that you can speak a lot more eloquently to it than I can.
Yeah. Well, Alexandra Burns, she worked on Elizabeth movie with Cate Blanchett years ago. So she is no stranger to the Elizabethan times. But she talked about the different wardrobes that she wanted to choose for this, because she knew that they were going to be out in the weather, outside in the rain and whatnot. So they wanted actual material that could wear over time, and still look warm, but still also be usable. So she chose a lot of denim, which is you wouldn't think, because historically denim's not the biggest choice back then, but denim ages well, and you can get a lot of use out of denim. So she chose denim for the men. She wanted them to be sexy, and the fabric was mostly denim, which is interesting. For Mary, she wanted the color red, because if Catholic martyrdom, definitely red, and the dress was as I read my notes, the Elizabeth's dressing was more strategic. She says she was in control of the power of her appearance, and used her appearance to replace the iconography of the Virgin Mary in Protestant England, and gave her specific outfits for specific occasions. And so they used red and orange to match in denim at the same time, for the orange rust from armor. So because we always see Mary outside and with the soldiers and stuff. So they had to like match the colors for her and the wardrobe with the men.
Absolutely. And I thought it definitely was it seemed like a very realistic portrayal. You know, the men looked, even though they were lords and so forth, noble, they still had dirt and so forth. And the Brits were a little bit, or the English more specifically, were a little bit more polished than the Scottish, you know, who kind of had more open lands and so forth. Whereas in England, everything seemed a lot more grander at the time.
Yeah, and Alexandra said that she purposely chose like really lavish dresses for Mary when she's out in public, but then when she's in private with her like handmaidens or in her bedroom and stuff, they're usually like looser fitted clothes, because she's the type of person who would like, once you take off, you know, the dress, she's like more of unbutton your pants and just let loose. Yeah. So they chose like silk kind of wardrobes for her.
Absolutely.
In the bedroom.
Let's now talk about the music, because I really appreciated the music. I think they went to great lengths. Max Richter did the score for this. They went to great lengths to have instruments of the time. And not only that, they sounded very epic, larger than life. You know, these women, in a sense, are larger than life. And when you talk about the connective tissue of it all, when you go from one scene to the next, and the music undercuts it where you have the same emotional feel to it, I thought that was a great device.
I really enjoyed the music. I think the moment that, like, when I first really noticed it was when they first cut to Elizabeth's castle that she's in, and there's like this overhead shot of just like zoom in on the castle. This is where she lives, and it was also music swell. It was so well done because they used English horns, and also a sort of electronic cloud of violins for some of the more coloristic sequences. But when they go to battle in the war, you always actually see the drums. So they use a lot of constant beat of field drums to foreshadow Mary's eventual fate.
Yeah, and I thought that was very effective because, I mean, drums keep a beat. Drums, and the faster you get with the drum, you know, your heart speeds up. And so the battle scenes themselves are already intense. And then, you know, the marching of drums to signify like a funeral, you're like, oh, well, that's deep and depressing. And ironically, one of the things that they talked about was the climax of the movie is not a battle, like, let's say, you know, they might say like a male director would probably push it towards. No, it was a very one-on-one into the scene where they
finally meet.
Yeah,
that's the climax of the movie.
Absolutely. So very interesting choices, and I appreciate how it all came together. So this movie has been out for a week now. When I say a week, it's very limited. So when we talk about box office, there really isn't that much to talk about. If we'd be doing it a disservice. It did have a budget of $25 million, and I think as time goes by, I think it'll make that back. It's not the highest score on Rotten Tomatoes, 65, which I don't understand why.
Right, and that's fairly low, and it's also unfortunate because it is still so limited right now. I wonder when and if they actually release it wide, if that'll boost the score, because I guarantee you not a lot of women have seen this film. And this is definitely, not to say it's a woman film, but this appeals more to the female demographic than it is to the males who are actually rating this on Rotten Tomatoes.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I don't get it. I really think it has a good message. I think it makes you introspect your own sort of aspect of life, regardless of if you're male, female. And ultimately, as I said earlier, I'm glad to walk away being like, you know what, as troubling as times are, I'm glad we're not living in those times.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's awful to live in those times. But I think it does do a good service having two strong female leads in this film. also directed by a female, so it's not like a man took over this. Like, it was treated by women. You can definitely tell. You can see how they treated women, and there was you can see the level of respect for the women in these positions. And I think it did a good job. It's beautiful, but also heartbreaking and wrenching at the same time. And there is a good balance. Granted, the film does not end on a happy note, so that might be why its score is kind of low, because it doesn't leave you with a good feeling at all.
Well,
but
it tries to.
yeah.
Where like she couldn't do this, but James
did.
Yeah.
But emotion-wise, you're just in a state. You're like, well, crap.
Yeah.
You know. So I can see why people didn't like it for that sense, because I think a lot of people love feel-good movies. You know, I do. But it's a beautiful film.
And one of the aspects when you look at it, two great actresses, yes, and they were both in contention, whether for I, Tonya and Lady Bird, right?
Yeah, last year.
So they're very strong actresses, and what I appreciate about this is that the fact that there's a sense like, listen, we both at the time made great movies. Now let's make a great movie together. So rather than be catty about it
against each other,
yeah, it's like, you know, let's do this great movie. And the only travesty as far as anything else is that they don't have more shared scenes together. But that was, you know, the fact that they shoehorned in one already is fantastic.
They already went against historical context and historical accuracy just to have this one scene together. But I don't mind that at all, because it's earned.
It's earned, and they knew. And it's also it's in keeping with the spirit in the sense that this, like, the correspondences that did happen between them probably would be very similar to what they interacted with. You know what I mean? It was just more immediate face to face, and all that. So let's talk about the awards it is up for so far. So we got Screen Actors Guild Award. Outstanding performance by a female actor in a supporting role. That's for Margot Robbie. Do you think she'll get that one?
I would like for her to get it, because she got a lot of individual attention for I, Tonya, mostly for the acting choices. And this one, Hollywood loves a transformation.
Yeah.
I mean, think of all the actors who have gone through a transformation and won Academy Awards. Like, Gary Oldman just won Best Actor for playing Winston Churchill, but he went through a heavy prosthetic makeup process for that. Charlize Theron, she got makeup for playing Eileen for Monster. She won an Academy Award for that. Nicole Kidman. I mean, the list goes on and on. Nicole went for Virginia Woolf, and she only wore like a nose for that. But Hollywood loves a transformation type of process to get into a character. So I think that definitely helps Margot just for recognition in that sense.
It's interesting that she's nominated, but Saoirse Ronan isn't. Saoirse's not. So it's interesting, but I think she could get it. So kudos there. Max Richter did already get honored for the Hollywood Music and Media Award. That was in November of this year, so kudos to him. I think as far as costuming and production design, it has a chance to really be nominated for some stuff as far as Oscars and take some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alexandra has worked on Elizabeth 1 and 2, which that movie, those movies got a lot of recognition during Academy Awards season 2, so she has a good chance.
Yeah, I think, you know, with a 65% on Rotten Tomatoes, it's kind of indicative of how critics think about it. Therefore, it's kind of indicative of how all these award shows are going to think about it. Which, and by that respect, it is unfortunately very sad that that's what's happening with a movie like this. I would like to see it be nominated for more stuff. I don't think it necessarily has to win. I think there's a lot of other good contenders, but you know, still recognize it just by giving it a nomination.
Definitely. I think Saoirse and Margot both individually have put on amazing performances for them both to get recognized for their acting.
Absolutely.
I think Saoirse for lead, because she was definitely more of the lead than Margot.
She's the titular character.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, that about wraps it up for us. Let us know your thoughts and opinions on this movie. What should it be nominated for? Also, how well do you know the history? How well did you like the movie? All that stuff. Anything you want to talk about, we appreciate it, and we encourage you to put it in the comments section. If you want to interact with us more directly, you can follow at Serafini TV.
That's right.
I'm at Phil Svitek. We will be doing Ben is Back. And believe it or not, that will actually be just due to timing reasons, right? Talk about timing with Mary and Elizabeth. Here at Anatomy and the studio and so forth, with holidays, the timing worked out as such that Ben is Back is going to be our final movie of 2018, which I know leaves a lot of movies uncovered until we come back in 2019. So we're gonna get to those.
Be backlogged for a couple weeks.
Yeah, so we're gonna do our best to get back on track. But in the meantime, fear not. There's lots of stuff you can look for. We've done over 500 movies at this point. So as you catch up on those, you can check it out. Also, quick shout out: Marisa and I did a show this week, Adapted, which we've been doing for quite a while. It's over on bookcircleonline.com. And we talk about books that have been turned into movies. This month we did Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. So if you appreciate books, if you like that movie, I think that's a fun. And if you like what we do here, it's very similar in nature to that. Very heady, I might say, if I'm being complimentative.
Yeah.
So, yeah, check it out. Anyway, thank you for a wonderful, wonderful year. We'll see you with Ben is Back if you join us for that. But if not, have a great rest of your 2018. See you in 2019.
From producers Maria Menounos, Kevin Undergaro, Phil Svitek, and the entire Popcorn Talk Network, we would like to thank you for tuning in. For questions or comments, be sure to visit popcorntalk.com. I'm Sir Richard Wentworth, and this has been a presentation of the Popcorn Talk Network.
The views expressed herein are those of the hosts only and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Popcorn Talk Network or its owners or principals.